Yezidi.
Yeah, exactly. There you go.
When Jillian transferred to Hillsdale in 2006, she walked into our collegiate newsroom with the meekness of Katy Perry. Not in volume, she wasn't loud, but she was confident, driven, and eager to write. I was news editor, fresh off of an internship in Washington, D.C., under an editor who made grown-ups cry, and I returned ready to kick my collegiate reporters into gear. Jillian didn't need any inspiring. It's impossible to forget the pink boa she occasionally wore, with heels and jeans and a shirt, but she wore it like you or I would wear a polo. That's Jillian. At the Collegian, while I nudged most reporters, I made attempts to rein Jillian in. Even back then, she loved investigative reporting. She wanted to unveil truth. This is very Hillsdalian. She was in the right place. And right out of the gate, Wyoming dirt still on her shoes, she was ready to sniff out the secrets, the deep throats, the skeletons of the college. This wasn't meshing so well with my endeavor as an editor to mend relationships with college administrators that had been broken by collegiate editors before me. The paper's reputation wasn't what it is now. It is excellent now. And I wanted to issue in a new era of trust and professionalism. Jillian was part of that. She became a leader at the Collegian too. She's also part of a new wave of successful journalists springing from Hillsdale and a leader of the pack. Jillian is a bit intrepid. Writer Charlie Cook told me in September that she got in touch a few years ago with Christopher Hitchens, the famous writer, and asked him to go to dinner with her in New York City. And he did. As Charlie told me, this is so Jillian. And it takes an intrepid person to travel the world, combat language barriers and cultural barriers and danger, and believe there are stories to tell, and that you're the one who can find the truth and tell them right. This is what Jillian does, and this is why she is here tonight. And now for our official introduction by Matt Melchior.
Hello, my name is Matt Melchior. I'm a marketing student here, a senior, with a journalism minor to complement that. And this journalism minor came to be after seeing a particular Hillsdale student excel after graduating Hillsdale College and the journalism program. And we're lucky enough to have her here tonight, and I particularly am excited. This journalist, I feel like I've known her my whole life, and I would even go so far as to say she's like family to me. And the reason I admire this journalist so much is she's first in line of 10 Melchior children, and she's also my dear sister. She writes for National Review as a fellow for the Franklin Center and Independent Women's Forum. Tonight I have the pleasure of introducing her. Her stories remind me how fortunate I am to introduce her here tonight, knowing that she's safe. Perhaps after tonight you'll understand why. I've been at home or heard the stories when she sells her various escapades to my parents, telling them, oh, it'll be fine, it's safe, I'm just interviewing a few people, nothing to worry about. However, when her articles surface and we read them, it becomes quite apparent that, to be quite frank, she's in some pretty dangerous situations, reporting on some very interesting things. Her investigative reporting has allowed her to report in China, Ukraine, and most recently Iraq. Tonight she'll share her experiences from Iraq and maybe give you a different perspective on how devastating terrorism can be. Because this talk is being broadcast, I will give the disclaimer that some of the content is graphic in nature and maybe not suitable to be broadcasted to children. However, you all look like you can handle this information in this room. Without any more, ladies and gentlemen, please help me in introducing and welcoming Miss Jillian Melchior.
Good evening. So in Endgame, which is an excellent history of the Iraq War, there's a story in it about how Ghazi al-Yawar, the Sunni vice president in 2005, broke down into tears in a meeting with General Casey. And this book describes that scene as an extraordinary display of emotion for an Arab politician. But having reported in Iraq, I'm actually a little surprised it's not more of a common reaction. Of all the countries I've visited and all the people I've talked to, Iraq is definitely the most hopeless and depressing place. And that makes it a really interesting place to write and to think about faith. Because in this God-forsaken land, religion is everything. And I think there's a tendency in Iraq to view it as just a place that's overrun by overwhelmingly evil people. And with the Islamic State controlling so much territory, that's a hard impression to argue with. But what caught me by surprise is that I met a lot of good people too, people who have perseverance and a reluctant but strong and powerful faith. And it's a mistake, I think, to imagine Iraq's persecuted Christians and Yezidis and other religious minorities as superhuman, to put them on a pedestal. I think what kind of makes their faith so special is that it's incredibly human. And if you put them on that pedestal, it undermines the humanity of their faith. And it depersonalizes them in a way that I think already happens a lot in Iraq. So it's a country where I think individuals have lost their humanity to a great extent already. I mean, these are people who have been slaughtered like animals. Their women have been treated like property, and they live in cities of tents now as refugees. And you look at these tents, it's just one after another. They live in fear of the cold, they live in fear of a fire starting at one of the tents and spreading to the others. And if you look at that, you're overwhelmed by the sense of personal loss. You're overwhelmed by the capacity. And in that, I think people become statistics rather than individuals. And that's an incredibly dangerous thing when you're looking at foreign policy. I mean, to be sure, Iraq's an incredibly complicated place, and it requires complex policy, complex moral judgment. But I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on that. I mean, I spent 10 days there. That is, incidentally, 8 more than Barack Obama spent when he ran for president, which I found kind of interesting. But through this speech, I don't want to win you over to a policy point. I want to show you the fundamental humanity of the Iraqis that I met there, and tell you some of their stories that moved me, that changed the way that I view it. Because now when I think about Iraq, weigh the policy decisions, I see these people's faces. And I know that there are decent people there who are enduring incredible stress, enormous struggles. And they're doing it with dignity and with an unlikely faith. So for starters, I think we tend to view Iraq as a majority Muslim country, and it is. But it's also a very diverse place religiously. So in 2003, Iraq was home to 1.4 million Christians. And between now and then, somewhere between a half and a third of, 2/3 rather, have left. And from Mosul alone, which is Iraq's second largest city, 6,000 people have left just this last summer. The first Iraqi Christians that I met were part of that population. And they were people who ran from the Islamic State, sometimes on foot, carrying their children, carrying their elderly. And on the scorching September day that I met them first, they were living in this half-built structure. Now, some of you have probably watched the show Homeland. It reminded me of that. If you know, in season 2, there's that big concrete structure that people are living in. It looks like that, but it's a little bit shorter. So this concrete floor is spotted with foul-smelling puddles. Refugees kind of strung up tarp to make these makeshift rooms. And there are flies everywhere. I mean, I'm writing things in my notebook as I'm interviewing them, and they're landing on my pen, they're landing on my face, on my hands. And as I talk to people, mothers are saying, you know, I don't want to live like this. I have to go next door to wash hands. And I'm afraid for my children because I know these conditions are squalorous. I know they're going to get sick. And children are everywhere. I mean, Iraq has more children than any place I've ever visited. And as I talked to refugees there, none of them could remember the last time they'd even heard the sound of silence. The people that lived in that building were the lucky ones. I met a newlywed man named Evan. He was an English teacher, and he told me that he couldn't sleep anymore because of the sound of bombs in his head. On the day he left his city of Karakosh, August 6th, a bomb had exploded, and it killed a woman and 2 young children. And he was near the explosion. He heard it. He smelled it. He felt the ground shake. And he says that when he closes his eyes at night, all he can think about is the sight of broken bodies being taken to a church next door. He fled, And what happened next in Karakash is very difficult to verify. There have been email chain letters circulating with missionaries claiming that children were being systematically beheaded after refusing to deny their faith. Now, I tried to verify that story. I can't. It seems to me that it's pretty impossible to verify. Reports I heard was that it was slightly exaggerated, but that at the same time it's definitely within the realm of the possible. So people that I knew from Karakash, when they left, they'd known the man who was beheaded, and they'd also seen children seized, being used as sex slaves, as child soldiers. So those Christians who've survived and escaped have literally lost everything except for their faith, and they're desperate to leave Iraq. Evan, who's the man who witnessed the bombing, told me that in his 3 decades alive, he can't remember the last time he experienced peace. And then for women, the situation's even worse. At that same half-built structure, I met a 22-year-old woman named Sarah. She was from the town of Bartella, outside of Mosul. And the Islamic State had torn down her church, but first it burnt the cross. And she remembers looking at that and just feeling hate, and she can't help it. She's 22 years old. She's just more desolate and more hopeless than any person I've ever met that age. And she tells me that's because she's a history student. She wants to be a lawyer at some point, but she's living in a country where there are no rights for women and where the situation's progressively getting worse. She can't see a future for herself unless she leaves Iraq, and it's increasingly unlikely that will happen. So I want to read you what she told me. She said, "I'm an Iraqi young girl. From the time I was born until now, we've had no good days. We've had a bad past, and we have a bad future. We lose our lives." And then she paused and looked at me and told me something that I found just fascinating. She said, "Religion is something that you choose. If you're free, you choose it. The Islamic State people tell you, you must convert. But people are free to choose 2 things, our honor and our religion." That choice is a difficult one. I learned this talking to Douglas Bazzi, a priest. He was a tough guy. He'd moved to Ankara from Baghdad, and in Baghdad he'd been shot in the leg, he'd been kidnapped for 9 days, and his church had survived 3 explosions targeted at their population. When he began there were 2,600 members of his church. When he left, only 250. So in other words, this is a man who really knows suffering. Nevertheless, on the surface when I met him, he seemed jovial. He had just this excellent grasp of the English language and a very generous sense of humor. 214 families, more than 700 people, were camping out on tents in the churchyard of Morelia, and he wanted to take care of them. So on the night I visited, he was hosting a pageant for them. He called it Morelia's Got Talent, and he'd stringed off rope to make this makeshift stage. He'd found this old microphone and this rickety projector, and he was talking people into singing Kurdish folk songs, kind of gently coaxing them to the stage. And he had a piece of paper and a pen, and he'd hold up ratings. And then he'd give them these grandiose critiques. And all of the refugees were rapt. This was the best thing that had ever happened to them. They were mesmerized, and for a minute, they forgot their suffering. But Father Bazzi hadn't forgotten his. He actually reminded me a lot of the whiskey priest in Graham Greene's The Power and the Glory. I asked him whether he believed, having seen all he'd seen, that God was in control. He wouldn't answer me. "That's an interesting question," he said. "Write that down." And that was his only response. He told me he worries about the practicality of saying, "Jesus loves you," to a population where they have plenty of children, no blankets, and a cold winter fast approaching. Nonetheless, he told me, if God works together for the good of all things for those who love him, then it's my responsibility, he said, to make sure that these Christians look back on this time as an opportunity. And so as a priest, he spent his time at Morelia Churchyard focusing on education, developing rigorous opportunities for these people, and focusing especially on educating young women, which I find very admirable. He also told anyone who had the opportunity to leave Iraq to go. And for those struggling with their faith and stuck in Iraq, I want to read you what he said. And that is that I tell people that their current situation is not because of what God did. It's because of what humans or politics did. We belong to God. We don't belong to anyone else. God saved us in the past, so let's account for the same God, because he's going to save us. But we have to put our hearts with God and not with anyone else. As Job said, why do we accept the good things from God and not the bad? It's not only Christians who are being targeted by the Islamic State, though. In fact, if we can describe unfettered brutality in a level of degrees, which is pretty questionable, to be honest, the Yazidis have had it, or the Christians have had it better than the Yezidis, which is another ancient religion. And that's because while ISIS views Christianity as an offshoot of Islam, it views the Yazidi faith as totally pagan and separate. And so it treats them with even more unchecked fury. The American media learned about the plight of the Yazidis this August, when the Islamic State invaded their villages and drove them up Mount Sinjar. Now, when I talk about Mount Sinjar, I'm not talking about a lush mountain with waterfalls and foliage. This is, the biblical Jonah. It's his Nineveh. And being there, you kind of get a sense of why he was so frustrated with God when God let the only tree giving him shade wither away to worms. I mean, this is a sparse, scorching, barren, treacherous place. And the fact that the Yazidis saw this as a preferable refuge says a lot about the unchecked sadism of the Islamic State. So sources that I interviewed, the Yazidis, told me that as they were going up this hill, Islamic State was shooting into the crowd. And there were parents that had more children, more elderly than they could carry. And they had to make the difficult decision about who to leave behind. And this woman saw wounded people dying on the side of the road. She saw children who were abandoned out of necessity, that were going to die of thirst, be attacked by animals, or be killed by the Islamic State. Atop that mountain, those who survived languished for more than a week. No food, no water, no shelter. Islamic State on 3 sides. They were finally rescued by the American airstrikes, but the trauma lingers. And I learned this when I met the Kodidad Kala family in the town of Badrash. My guide had made friends with them. We went to bring them bedding, because before that, the entire family had been sleeping on a dirt floor with 1 blanket. The family had always been poor, but you could tell from just being in the room with them that they had love. The father's name was Hassan, and he won me over right away. He showed me his arm. He didn't have a ring on his finger, but he had a heart that he'd gotten tattooed there. And when I asked him what it was his wife's name inside. And she was so sheepish when he told me that. She giggled, and it was just really charming. But their house, if you can call it that, the place they were living, was no longer happy. And that's because, I remember in this shelter counting 6 children, and except for the babies, none of them were normal, boisterous kids. They weren't acting like children do. They were sitting there silent, stone-faced. And most striking was Hassan's daughter, Claudia. She was 4 years old, wild dark hair, and these dark eyes, so angry, so intense, just staring at me. And when you looked away from her eyes, you could see her feet, and her toenails were completely shattered or missing. And that's from her time up on Sinjar Mountain. Hassan told me that Claudia had seen people die along the way. ISIS had captured 20 women and girls in his extended family. They don't know what happened to them. Hassan told me that 8 men in his extended family had also been killed. And it bothered him deeply that he knew their bodies were still lying on the spots where they'd been butchered. I know no one's there to make a grave for them, he told me. Claudia rarely speaks at 4 years old, but Hassan said that when she does, she asks when the Islamic State is going to come kill them. Hassan's family was not the only one wrecked by tragedy. In the town of Sharia, about an hour's drive north of ISIS-held Mosul, I met a young woman named Amsha. She was 19 years old. She'd been married to the love of her life, a man named Khalil. They had a 2-year-old son together who he adored, and she was 4 months pregnant with her second child when the Islamic State came. Amsha and Khalil tried to flee on foot, but the Islamic State caught up to them. And when it did, it separated the men from the women. Now, I can't speak to what happened in this situation, but there have been reports of men being beheaded, being buried alive. All I know is that Amsha tells me that when she was separated, she heard a spate of gunshots, and her heart sank. The Islamic State took her to a warehouse in Mosul. It housed around 2,000 women, she estimates, and all of them were grieving. They told her basically to convert or die. And she said that she kept her Yezidi faith in her head, but she had to convert, so she pretended to. After 10 days in that warehouse, they took her to a smaller house nearby, and it was just her 2-year-old son, and a bunch of black-dressed, bearded jihadis. Now, these men beat her. They locked her and her son in a room, no food, no water. Did all of this to coerce her into 2 sham marriages. And when she finally consented, they were angry that she'd held out that long. This woman was repeatedly raped, repeatedly beaten. And they used to bring her son in front of her, hand him a giant weapon, and tell him that they were going to train him to be just like they were. Well, finally, they told Amsha that they were going to take her to Syria, that they were going to make her be a bride to even more jihadis. And that was the turning point for her. She decided that essentially, even if she tried to escape and died, that would be no less bad and probably better than what they'd already done to her. So she took her 2-year-old son in the middle of the night and ran. She wandered a long time down a road, and a kind Sunni man saw her. Reluctantly, she confessed her story to him. And he took compassion on her. He told her, "That's not what Islam stands for. We don't believe this." He took her into her house, hid her, along with his family, and they smuggled her to the Kurdish border. Now, when I talked to her, it was a few weeks after her escape. Her bruises had started to fade, but the emotional trauma was there. But at 19 years old, I was impressed with her strength. She'd been through incredible trauma, but she wanted her story told to the West. And she told it in a voice that was a little bit high, a little bit quiet, but nonetheless strong. Until we brought up the topic of her husband. I wanted to understand the relationship that they'd had, who he'd been before, who she'd been before this. And she couldn't finish. She looked at me, drew her knees up to her chest, hid her face behind the veil, and wept. One of her closest friends was there, told me that her husband was, in his words, more awesome than she was. And he clearly adored her. So we waited, and we waited. And finally he told me, "It's just too painful." In the name of religion, the Islamic State has captured many women like Amsha as sex slaves. I've seen estimates ranging from between 1,000 to 7,000 women. And in the Islamic State's official publication, disturbingly available in English, Dabiq, they actually glorify slavery. They say sexual slavery is part of what they believe in and something that necessitates, or their religion necessitates. The Islamic State even encourages some of these women to phone home, telling them to recount the horrors that they've endured to their families. I talked to one girl who was 18 years old, a high school senior, and she told me that she mourns her cousin. She knows a little bit about what happened because an escaped woman told her from a cell phone call. This woman's beaten and raped more routinely than she's fed. What she heard about her cousin was that she prays that an American airstrike will kill her along with the jihadis. Now, to be honest, remembering the painful stories of Iraq's believers, it's really difficult for me to draw the kind of sweeping and big conclusions that make for a good speech. So from Dr. Morrissey's class, actually, I remember discussing just war and about how a war not only needs to be justifiable and good, but in the national interest. And as I've thought about Iraq, I've heard compelling arguments on both sides about whether the initial war was a just war or not. Leaving that aside, I want to say that it really morally bothers me, having seen these people, that the United States made a commitment to them and then abandoned them. I think that left them essentially wide open to this kind of horror. And this becomes more troubling now because I've seen firsthand that in addition to fanatics and terrorists and psychopaths, Iraq has a great share of good people, moderate Muslims, Yezidis, devout Christians, people who love their families, who try to do their best, and who are suffering greatly without any end in sight. And without seeing these individuals, there's a temptation to swear off Iraq, to say, this is a godforsaken place that's never going to be right. Let them kill each other off. But for me, I know that there will be plenty of killing. When the good perish, I think it's all the more fearsome to consider who will remain. Thank you. Any questions? Yep.
The people you spoke with were almost all Kurds. Were there some Arabs as well?
Yeah, actually, there were a good amount. So I went to a church outside in Ankara, which it's kind of near Erbil, and they had a lot of Shia refugees from sort of the sidelines that had fled in with the Islamic State. There was actually a little girl. She got really attached to me really fast. She was following me all around for 2 hours as I was doing interviews. And we decided we were going to interview her. And it was kind of the same thing as the little girl with the broken toenails, that when we talked about the Islamic State, she'd seen the propaganda. I mean, they're in such close quarters that kids hear adults talk and they really know about what's going on and what the implications of that are. And some of them have seen that violence firsthand. And she was telling me that, she's like 7 years old. She's telling me that she knows they'll kill kids and she can't understand why. And that just bothered her. And her parents had a similar reaction. I mean, they're Muslim, they're Shia, not Sunni. But, they were willing to go fight for it. They were concerned for their families. I think it's something that's had a pretty profound effect across all of Iraq. Yeah.
What kinds of opinions of the United States did you encounter?
Two mainly. I was in Kurdistan, which is pretty overwhelmingly pro-American. So one of the things, I always buy honey for my mom when I travel because it's supposed to taste different depending on the region you're in. So I went to this honey store. It's one of the few things for fun I did there. And the guy heard I was American and he was just beside himself. Pours me this big thing of honey. Oh, America, I love America. I love your airstrikes. And then he goes, tell Obama hello for me. Tell him thank you. So it was pretty overwhelmingly pro-American there. The other thing I heard when I was talking to Amsha, the 19-year-old girl, the guy who did the translation for that was not my normal fixer. It was her close friend. And he had been a translator for the U.S. Army. His English was phenomenal. And it was good because they had a trust relationship. But he was really anxious because he felt like he'd given a lot to the American cause, that he believed in the Democracy Project, that he'd really put his life on the line for it, and that now not only were they absent, but he had no out.
Can you tell us a little bit about the situation in Kurdistan as opposed to the rest of Iraq or Syria, about the Peshmerga fighters that defend Kurdistan, and if you happen to know anything about Americans or Westerners who have self-deployed to Kurdistan to fight ISIS?
I wish I knew some of them. I don't. I did get to go to a Kurdish military base. So the situation with Kurdistan, it's Iraq, but it's not, which makes it a little bit safer. This is a really inexact comparison, but it's kind of like how Hong Kong is a part of China, but not. So it's its own special administrative region, if you will. It's got a government, but it's kind of its own state. So the Peshmerga fighters are pretty much the only capable ones there. When the Iraqi army collapsed, they defended the line. And they're very competent. I mean, I've stayed in touch with a couple of them on Facebook, and it's been really interesting to see their observations about it. The thing that was really interesting to me, we talked to this commander who is related to the Kurdish president. He was the nephew, I think. And he was saying that even for his soldiers, the psychological warfare has been a huge, huge impactful thing for them. That because men have seen what happens to women and children who are left behind, that they're always going to have that in the back of their head when they leave to fight, and that makes them a little bit less bold. And he was saying that that's something that's been a huge problem, in addition to how dirty the Islamic State fights, in addition to the bombings, that was one of the things he identified as a crucial problem. He seemed to think that American airstrikes could hold the line in Kurdistan, that it wouldn't be enough to knock out the Islamic State as a whole. On top of that, I guess I didn't meet any Americans that had gone there, but they're definitely outnumbered. They're a fierce bunch. A lot of them have bought their own weapons. It's illegal to buy guns in Kurdistan. They shut that down. And they used to have an old gun bazaar. I'm really sad I missed it by a couple weeks. And I hear that part of the I don't know if this is true, but I hear that part of the reason that they shut it down was because they knew international, armaments were going to be coming in, and they were afraid of it being detected or making its way to the black market and getting caught for it, essentially. But a lot of these people had bought their own bulletproof vests, their own boots, were doing it with their own funds.
What did you feel like the reporting brought to the Americans, and just the readership's understanding of what's going on here? What new and involving things?
Well, I think a lot of it tends to cover the big picture, and that's as it should be. But I kind of hoped to tell the story of people that didn't have a voice, and to talk about the innocents, and also to put a human face on it. war is a really big abstract thing, but it does affect individual lives. I feel like that's got to be part of the calculation. And it's also important to me when I do foreign correspondence to feel like there's a good guy in some respect, or at least a moral, like it's not just completely seedy and corrupt and decrepit. And for me, with the Christian connection and with the Yezidis in particular, I felt like that was something that, in a way, my reporting could get behind or support or give a new insight into. Mm-hmm.
I know more of your reporting was with innocents, women, and children.
Mm-hmm.
Would you say you have a better picture of the end game there? Do you have any ideas of how to possibly defeat ISIS for your trip? Do you know what the people there think? Do they think they'll ever get rid of them? What's the end game of getting rid of ISIS, or maybe not?
It's pretty hopeless. People I talk to there don't have high expectations. I think right now they're thinking that they can hold the line at Kurdistan and keep that safe. But, I mean, they feel that from a military standpoint, airstrikes are going to be enough to maybe keep them at bay for a while. They've already seen the Islamic State change strategy to cope with the airstrikes and get around it. And also, they're afraid because their military fell apart. They're afraid because when the Islamic State took cities, it also took American armaments. So it's got some really high-tech, beefy equipment. So, I mean, it's rough to say. I kind of agree with them right now. Maybe the situation will change, but it does look pretty bleak, and it looks like not a lot of people in the international community want to stick it out, want to eliminate the Islamic State from Iraq or Syria. And, I mean, it was an entrenched engagement, but I do think it will take international forces to knock them out. Mm-hmm.
You saw a lot of military aid. Did you run into any other international goodwill aid for the people that you sort of were in the midst of?
Yeah, we went to a UN-run refugee camp, which was really interesting and strangely hopeful. I mean, it was an awful place. They were telling me about how afraid they were that in the winter a fire would start and it would spread across. It hadn't happened in their camp, but in another camp it had happened, and a woman and her family died in it. So that was something that was a lot of anxiety. But I think what was interesting for me there was it was a lot of Syrian refugees, and they got on with life. I met this boy who is probably 17 or 18 years old. He'd figured out that there was a market for clothing there, and so he'd go into town, buy 5 or 6 items of clothes, figure out what things were needed, borrowed some money from his brother, and within about a year he'd built it into this clothing business inside the refugee camp. Now, another thing that was really interesting was, I guess in the Kurdish part, social norms are a little bit more relaxed, and so people from across Syria, or Syrian and Iraqi refugees, were meeting each other, socializing, getting married. My tour guide had just been married a week before, and it was somebody she never would have met had she not been in this refugee camp. They had weddings there. They had a band that was the local band. So it was kind of, on one situation, you can look at it and just think it's a terrible, terrible situation, which it definitely is, but I was impressed with the resourcefulness and spunk of the people there. They were just really great. And I think internationally it helped that to some extent, but a lot of it was just their strength of spirit. Anybody else? Oh, yeah?
In Iraq journalism, one gets mixed up with the conflict in Iraq is portrayed as if it's fundamentally religious.
Mm-hmm.
Sunni, Shia, that's, there's something in there. What's it really about? When's the heat?
I think it's there. The more I read up on Iraq, you definitely see that there are sectarian tensions that are going to be pretty insurmountable. I'm skeptical that they'll be able to overcome them. The Kurdish part is a bit better. I knew both Shia and Sunni Muslims there who were tolerant of other points of view, tolerant of each other, just wanted to have a functional country. But it's also difficult because people in Iraq feel like it's an arbitrarily drawn country, kind of just jumbled together. And they're more loyal to and I'm speaking in generalities, not for everybody, but I think they're more loyal as a whole to their particular sectarian group or their religious affiliation, and it's hard to clump them together in a country and make it function, and they're not sure what to do about it, I'm not sure what to do about it. All right.
That's all. Let's just give her a round of
Oh,
applause.
thank you.